I was still wearing black when I sat down at my son's table. The candles flickered against the kitchen walls. The smell of clam chowder rose from the pot, and for the first time since the funeral, I thought maybe we could eat in silence. My name is Rowena Hale. I am 71 years old, recently widowed, and I had come to this supper because my son asked me to. I believed it was a chance to be together, to remember the man we had lost. Instead, the words that cut through the steam of the soup came from my daughter-in-law. She slid the bowl in front of me, leaned just enough to catch my eyes, and said, "Now that your husband is gone, grieve, pack your bags, and never come back." The spoon in my hand trembled. I looked across the table at Caleb, my only child, hoping for his protest, but he kept his gaze steady, almost rehearsed, and muttered, "It's what Dad would have wanted. I'm the executor. We'll sort it all." The kitchen clock ticked loud enough to drown my heartbeat. I felt my throat burn with words I could not say. In that moment, I understood they had already decided I was no longer part of this house, that my grief was an inconvenience they wanted cleaned up like the dishes stacked in the sink. I forced my shoulders back. Instead of crying, I reached into my purse and laid my Visa card on the table when the check for groceries came. I paid without hesitation, signed my name slowly, and whispered a thank you that carried more steel than gratitude. At 8 o'clock, I pushed back my chair, my black dress brushing against the floor, and told them evenly, "If you want paperwork, I'll bring the whole cabinet." I left the smell of roast chicken behind and walked into the night air, my mind colder than the November wind. They thought I was finished, but the truth was just beginning. Back in my own house, the silence was so thick I could hear the creak of every board under my shoes. The dining room still held the scent of flowers from the funeral, faded roses wilting in glass vases. I switched on the lamp above the desk and reached for the key that had always hung behind the china cabinet. My husband had shown me once, years ago, how to open the small steel safe tucked into the wall. I had never needed to, until that night. The lock clicked, heavy and final, and I pulled open the door. Inside lay a stack of binders, each labeled in his careful handwriting, and a thick envelope sealed with tape. My hands shook as I opened it. On top was a letter, written in blue ink that had begun to fade. "Rowena," it said, "if you're reading this, I can't be there to shield you anymore. The trust will keep you safe. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. You are the successor trustee. Seagate belongs to the trust, and the trust belongs to you." I read it twice, then pressed the paper against my chest. The grief clawed at me, but beneath it came a steadiness I hadn't felt all week. Executor or not, Caleb had no authority over what my husband had built. The house, the business, the reserves, they were not his to sort through like old clothes. I placed the letter back in the envelope, then opened the first binder. Tabs lined the edges. Bank accounts, contracts, loan notes. Each section was proof that my husband had prepared for this storm. The tears on my cheeks dried into resolve. If they wanted a battle of paperwork, I was more than ready to fight on that field. The next morning, I buttoned my coat and drove into town. The air was sharp with November frost, and the Hudson shimmered pale gray beyond the bridge. I walked into Hudson River Bank at exactly 9 o'clock, the same place where my husband had kept the company's accounts for decades. Behind the counter, Janice Rowe, a woman with silver hair and a reputation for precision, greeted me with a nod. She had attended the funeral. Her eyes softened when she saw me, but she didn't waste time with platitudes. "Mrs. Hale," she said, "I assume you're here about the trust accounts." I slid the binder across the desk and opened to the section marked Statements. She adjusted her glasses and compared them with the bank's records. The numbers matched down to the cent, but there was more. She leaned closer, tapping the screen. "These withdrawals over the past 2 years," she said. "They're not gifts. They're logged as shareholder advances, official loans payable back to the company." She printed the record, each line showing Caleb's name, the dates, the amounts, and the running balance that now reached well into 5 figures. I felt a tightness in my chest, not from shock, but from vindication. Every dollar my son had taken was written down as debt, not inheritance. Janice wasn't finished. She pulled another file. "Last spring, your husband secured a business line of credit, $350,000. He used the company's warehouse as collateral, not the house." The word steadied me more than any embrace could have. The house was safe. The trust was intact. Caleb's claims would crumble in the face of this paperwork. I left the bank with a folder of copies pressed against my chest, the cold wind no longer biting, but bracing. The fight was shifting in my favor. That afternoon, I walked into the brick office of Denise Park, our company's accountant for nearly 15 years. The smell of coffee and printer ink filled the air, steady and familiar. Denise rose from her chair, her blazer neat, her expression calm but alert. She had seen enough family disputes to know this wasn't just a courtesy visit. I set the binder on her desk. "I need you to walk me through every figure that involves Caleb." She adjusted her glasses and opened her laptop, pulling up the general ledger. The columns of numbers appeared in orderly lines, merciless in their clarity. She clicked on a tab labeled Loans to Shareholders. Caleb's name sat there, attached to withdrawals stretching back years. The total balance stood at $87,000, but with accrued interest and late fees, it had risen to over 96. "Your husband documented every advance," she said. "These aren't gifts, Rowena. They are loans, enforceable with signed notes. If necessary, you can demand repayment." The word steadied me, but Denise wasn't finished. She pulled another folder and laid out the operating agreement for Seagate Custom Builds. Her finger tapped the clause in bold letters. "The sole member of the LLC is the Hale Family Living Trust. Successor trustee maintains full authority." In plain terms, that meant me, not Caleb, not Sloan. Me. I leaned back in the chair, the tension in my shoulders loosening. For days I had been treated like an afterthought, a widow with no voice. Yet here, in black ink, my authority was unshakable. Denise closed the folder and looked at me directly. "If you want, we can draft a repayment plan, something binding, something with teeth." I nodded slowly. My grief was still raw, but now it had a sharp edge. Paper was my shield, and I intended to use it. The next morning, I drove to a site on Maple Street, where Seagate was finishing a 2-story home. Sawdust floated in the cold air, hammers rang in steady rhythm, and the smell of fresh pine cut through the frost. For a moment, I just stood at the edge of the lot, watching the skeleton of the house rise, each beam a reminder that my husband's work lived on. Miguel Santos spotted me before I reached the porch frame. He pulled off his hard hat, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt despite the chill. "Mrs. Hale?" he said, his voice carrying both respect and concern. "We didn't expect you out here." "I needed to see it with my own eyes," I answered. "Tell me, Miguel, how is the company really doing?" He gestured toward the workers setting trusses into place. "The jobs are steady. Clients still trust us. The crew is loyal. The only problem has been Caleb showing up. asking for advances outside the schedule. Your husband used to tell me to keep the men focused and let the books handle the rest. I pulled out my phone and snapped photos of delivery tickets, timesheets, and progress notes pinned to a clipboard by the trailer. Every scrap of proof mattered now. Miguel wiped his brow and leaned closer. We can build, ma'am, but someone has to keep the vultures off the roof. His words struck deeper than he knew. This company wasn't failing. It was breathing, strong and steady. If only I guarded its lungs from being crushed. I walked back to my car with boots coated in mud and a new conviction. Caleb and Sloan might treat me as disposable, but the foundation of Seagate was still mine to protect. Howard Keene's office overlooked the courthouse square, its shelves lined with leather-bound volumes that smelled faintly of dust and polish. He had been our family attorney for years, the kind of man who spoke in measured tones that carried weight without effort. When I walked in with my binder, he rose and shook my hand firmly, as though to anchor me. I need clarity, I said, sitting across from him. Caleb keeps calling himself the executor, as if that gives him power over everything. Does it? Howard opened the binder, scanned the trust papers, and then looked at me over the rim of his glasses. Executor status applies only to assets outside the trust. Your husband placed the house, the business, and major accounts into the Hale Family Living Trust. That means, Rowena, you as successor trustee hold sole authority. Caleb's role as executor covers little more than an old sedan, a checking account with a few $100s, and some personal effects. Nothing more. The relief washed through me, but it carried a bitter edge. Caleb knew none of this, or worse, ignored it. Howard drew out a yellow legal pad. Here's what we'll do. You'll call a formal meeting with Caleb and Sloan. I'll draft notices and attach copies of the loan records, the trust excerpt, and the operating agreement. If they dispute, we'll remind them that trust assets are legally shielded. And if Caleb refuses repayment, we'll file a stipulation that converts his debt into judgment upon default. He tapped his pen for emphasis. Also, I'll add a right of residence clause to make it explicit you remain in the house. They can't push you out. For the first time since the funeral, I felt the ground beneath me solid. The storm wasn't over, but now I carried a map through it. The kitchen table had always been the center of our home, the place for Sunday breakfasts and late-night talks. That evening, it became something else entirely. I had asked Caleb and Sloan to meet me there at 6. Denise, our accountant, sat at the end of the table with her ledger and laptop, a neutral witness who carried the quiet authority of numbers. Caleb leaned back in his chair, arms folded, wearing the same expression he had as a boy when he thought he could outstare me. Sloan perched beside him, lips pressed thin, her eyes scanning the room like she already owned it. I opened the folder and slid the first page across. This is the record of every advance you've taken, Caleb. It totals more than $96,000 with interest. These aren't gifts. They are loans, with your signature here. He bristled. Dad wanted me to have that money. You're twisting it. Denise cleared her throat, tapping the entry on her screen. Each withdrawal is coded as a loan receivable. That's enforceable. Her calm voice left no room for argument. Sloan jumped in, her tone sharp. Executor means the house is ours to list. You can't just stay here forever. I pulled out the trust excerpt, placing it beside the loan schedule. This house is in the trust. The trust gives me right of residence. Executor status doesn't touch it. You can contest the grief in this family, but you cannot contest the law. Silence filled the room, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. I folded my hands and looked at my son. I'm not asking for war, Caleb. I'm asking for repayment. You'll do it because it's written and because it's right. They came to push me out. Instead, they left with a calendar and a pen. 2 days later, we gathered in Howard Keene's office, the long oak table polished to a shine that reflected every tense face around it. Caleb sat across from me, his jaw tight, eyes darting toward the door as if escape might still be possible. Sloane crossed her legs, arms folded, the picture of defiance. Howard placed a stack of documents between us and clicked his pen. "This," he said, sliding the first page forward, "is the repayment agreement. 48 months, fixed interest, automatic ACH withdrawal from Caleb's personal account on the 15th of each month. If he misses by more than 15 days, the stipulation for entry of judgment will be filed with the county clerk. That means the debt becomes an enforceable judgment immediately." Caleb's lips parted, but no words came. He scanned the page, eyes tracing the line where his name was printed. Howard continued, his tone steady. "To secure the debt, Caleb pledges his work truck and 10% of future bonuses from his employer. A UCC-1 lien will be filed this afternoon." I sat still, my hands folded neatly in my lap, but inside my pulse thudded with finality. This wasn't revenge. It was structure, consequence, law. Sloane leaned forward, voice sharp. "And what about the house? You can't just—" Howard cut her off, pointing to the trust excerpt. "The house is untouchable. It remains under Rowena's right of residence. Executor status has no bearing here." The pen scratched against paper as Caleb signed, his signature jerking at the end. Sloane signed an acknowledgement that she would not contest trust assets. I breathed slowly, almost quietly. Promises had been air before. Now they were paper, ink, and the courthouse waiting to enforce them. 2 months later, the weight of the agreement began to show. The automatic withdrawal cleared from Caleb's account like clockwork, each payment cutting into his paycheck before he even saw it. I didn't need to chase him. The bank did it for me. For the first time in years, I held the upper hand without raising my voice. Sloane, however, did not hide her bitterness. One gray afternoon, I overheard her at the grocery store, snapping into her phone about overdue rent. By the following week, their landlord had posted a late notice on their front door. Sloane glared at me in church that Sunday, as if I were the reason for her humiliation. But it wasn't me. It was the numbers, and the numbers did not bend. Caleb looked worn, shadows under his eyes, but something in him was shifting. His employer required financial counseling as part of a benefits program, and for once, he attended. Denise told me quietly that he had begun asking real questions about budgeting, about responsibility. I prayed he would hold on to that thread. Meanwhile, I found my own form of healing. On Tuesday evenings, I drove to the town library where a circle of widows met in a quiet room upstairs. We shared coffee, stories, and the unspoken relief of being with others who understood. For the first time since the funeral, I didn't feel like an intruder in my own life. Justice did not roar. It whispered. It showed itself in overdue notices, in signed checks, in the steady rhythm of accountability. And as I left the library each week, carrying the scent of old books and paper on my coat, I knew I was no longer merely surviving. I was learning how to live again. By the time spring thawed the edges of the Hudson, Seagate was breathing strong again. I drove out to a site along the river where the crew was framing a new home, the wood fresh and golden against the pale sky. The clang of hammers and the hum of saws filled the air like a steady heartbeat. Miguel walked over, dust on his boots and pride in his smile. "We won the Riverside bid," he told me, handing me the signed contract. Clients said they chose us because we always finish on time. They don't worry about money games anymore. I stood there in the chill wind, watching men lift beams into place. They looked steady, confident, freed from the shadow of Caleb's unexpected visits. It wasn't just a company regaining order. It was my husband's legacy finding its rhythm again. The profits from the last quarter were modest, but real. Instead of pocketing them, I reinvested. I approved safety training for every worker and arranged health insurance coverage that Miguel had long requested. Their gratitude showed not in speeches, but in the way they worked. Fewer absences, straighter lines, cleaner cuts. One evening, after reviewing invoices at my desk, I found a letter slipped beneath the door. It was from a client who had hired Seagate a decade earlier. "Your husband would be proud," it read. Simple words, but they carried more weight than any balance sheet. I pressed the letter flat on the desk, my eyes stinging. Grief still came, sudden as a wave, but it no longer pulled me under. It was the tide, and I had learned how to stand against it. The company was alive, and so was I. 6 months after the funeral, I sat on the front porch as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of amber. The binder rested on my lap, though I no longer needed to open it. Every page had already spoken. Caleb pulled into the driveway, his truck rumbling like it carried the weight of his choices. Sloan followed him up the steps, her face tight, her voice clipped. "We need more time," she said before even sitting down. "My mother's been sick. The bills—" I raised a hand, calm but firm. "I'm not erasing the debt, but Howard can modify the plan temporarily if you provide documentation. That's the only way." Caleb nodded. His shoulders slumped. For the first time, his eyes met mine without challenge. "I'm sorry, Mom, for the things I said, for letting her speak for me." His voice cracked at the edges, and I knew the apology was real, though thin and late. I didn't rush to embrace him. I had learned restraint was its own form of love. "Keep showing up, Caleb," I said. "That's how you make it right." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of lilacs from the garden. Sloan said nothing more. She turned away, realizing her arguments had no purchase here. 2 weeks later, I drove east to Montauk, where a small cottage waited by the sea. The waves rolled steady against the shore, and I spent my evenings watching the light spill through sea glass on the windowsill. Love, I realized, was not covering someone else's bill. Love was giving them the invoice and the chance to pay it. At last, I could breathe in peace, my future written not in fear, but in tide and light.